There is a question you are never supposed to ask, and Nima Salrath had just asked it in front of the entire Senate. She had stood in the great pale chamber on the Velthani homeworld, 400 years old, the finest reckoner of her generation, and she had told 11,000 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy that the law their civilization was built on was not a law at all. That it had an exception. That the exception was alive, and growing, and had just defeated an Accord fleet at a frontier rock called Anvil. And then she had told them the thing that could not be unsaid, that somewhere in their own sacred archive, 10,000 years deep, there was a hole shaped exactly like a species, and that someone, long ago, had cut humanity out of history on purpose. The chamber had gone very quiet. And then, one by one, the elders of the Accord had done the thing that frightened Nima more than any battle ever had. They had not argued with her. They had not been angry. They had looked at her with a terrible gentle pity, the way you look at a beloved instrument that has finally, after centuries of service, begun to give wrong readings. They thanked her for 400 years of service. They relieved her of her station. They placed her under what they called review. And as the guards walked her out of the chamber that had held her whole life's work, an elder she had respected for 2 centuries leaned close and said the words that told Nima Salrath she was right about everything, and in terrible danger. He said, "Child. Some doors were sealed by people wiser than you. Leave them sealed." The last reckoner who went looking for that hole in the archive did not retire. She simply stopped being in the records. And then he smiled at her, kindly, and walked away. The hole in the archive was real. And the Accord knew it was there. And they had been guarding it for 10,000 years. Rhea Maddox wanted exactly one thing in the entire galaxy, and it was not glory. She wanted to go home. She wanted to take her daughter out of the deep shelters under the cargo terminals where the child had spent 19 days in the dark, and she wanted to find some quiet corner of some quiet world, and she wanted to never again make a decision that ended with a list of names in her own handwriting. That was all. After Anvil, she felt she had earned it. In the first week after the siege, before any of the rest of it began, Rhea had done nothing but sit with Nell. The child had come out of 19 days in the dark changed in a way that did not show on the surface. She still narrated everything she did out loud, still had the gap in her front teeth, still ran everywhere instead of walking. But she had started checking. That was the word Rhea used for it in her own mind. Nell checked. She would be playing, absorbed, ordinary, and then she would stop and look up and find her mother in the room, confirm she was there, and only then go back to playing. Over and over, all day. She did not ask Rhea not to leave. She had learned, in the dark under the cargo terminals, that asking did not control the world. She simply checked, silently, again and again, that the one thing she could not bear to lose had not yet been taken. Rhea understood that look completely, because she had spent 19 days doing the same thing in her own way, holding a wall 400 meters above the dark so that the checking would always find her there. She had promised her daughter she was not going anywhere. She had kept it. And now she wanted, more than she had ever wanted anything, to spend the rest of her life being the thing that was always there when Nell looked up. The galaxy had other plans. You have to understand what Anvil had become in the weeks since the siege broke. To Rhea it was a graveyard with her friends in it. To humanity it was a word. A frontier quartermaster with no military training had looked at the full weight of a 100,000-year-old empire and refused to fold, and her colony of farmers and dock workers had held 19 days against a fleet that had never lost, and they had held long enough for the hearth to learn the enemy and break that fleet in the sky. It was the first time in 2 centuries of expansion that humanity had beaten the Accord at anything. And the hearth, the loose coalition of human worlds that had spent those 2 centuries being treated as small and new and beneath notice, had found in the rubble of Anvil something it had never had before. Proof. A story. A name. They came for Rhea Maddox 6 weeks after the siege, and they did not come with orders, because the hearth could not order her to do anything. They came with a request, and the request was worse than an order, because she could refuse an order. His name was Admiral Sefa Oduya, and he had crossed 200 light-years to sit across a table from a tired woman in a half-rebuilt port town and tell her the truth, which was that humanity was now at war with the entire galaxy whether it wanted to be or not. The Accord did not lose wars. It had lost one. It would not simply accept that. It would come back, with more, and it would keep coming, because an empire built on the certainty that everyone yields cannot survive the existence of a people who do not. One of them had to be wrong about how the universe worked, and neither side could afford for it to be them. We learned how they fight, Oduya told her. Your people bought that with their lives, at Anvil. We're using it. We're pushing them off the frontier worlds they took, one at a time, and it's working, because they fight by a book and we finally have the book. He paused. But we don't have what you have. The frontier is scared, Captain. People who never thought they could stand against the Accord need to believe they can. You're the one who proved it. I'm not asking you to fight. I'm asking you to let them see your face. Rhea looked at him for a long time. She thought about Nell, asleep for the first time in weeks in a room with a window. She thought about Garrick, the old machinist, dead on a barricade so that 40 people could reach the shelters. She thought about the list. You want to make me a flag, she said. Yes, Oduya said. He did not insult her by pretending otherwise. I do. And here is the thing that Rhea Maddox understood, sitting in that room, that would become the quiet tragedy at the center of everything that followed. She understood that she was going to say yes. Not because she wanted to. Because she had learned, in 19 days on a wall, the same terrible lesson her whole species seemed to carry in its blood, that the unbearable thing does not go away when you put it down. It only moves to someone else's shoulders. If she went home, the war came anyway, and it came to a frontier full of people who did not yet believe they could survive it, and some of them would fold who did not have to, and she would have been the one who could have shown them otherwise and chose her own quiet instead. There was a moment, before she answered, that Rhea would return to many times in the months ahead. Oduya had brought a child's drawing with him. Not Nell's. It belonged to a girl on a frontier world called Reisman's Hollow, a world that had heard about Anvil and had decided, when an Accord corrective force arrived at its sky, to fight instead of fold. They had no quartermaster who had learned the enemy. They had no 19 days of bought knowledge. They had only the story of Anvil and the belief that if a colony of dock workers could refuse to break, so could they. They had been wrong. Reisman's Hollow had not held. And the drawing in Oduya's hand had been recovered from the ruins, a child's bright crayon picture of a woman standing on a wall with the word Anvil spelled out underneath in careful uneven letters, because somewhere in the last days of a dying colony, a little girl had drawn the woman she believed was coming to save her. No one had come. Rhea had been home, sleeping in a room with a window. I'm not showing you this to make you feel guilty, Oduya said, and she believed him, which was worse. I'm showing you because the story is already out there, with or without you. People are already standing on walls because of what you did. The only question is whether the woman in the drawing is a real person who can teach them how to actually survive, or just a picture that gets them killed believing in it. So Rhea Maddox, who wanted only to go home, said yes to becoming a flag. She did not know yet that the war she was joining was not really about Anvil, or the frontier, or even the Accord. She did not know that the real war was 10,000 years old, and that it had been waiting, sealed in the dark, for humanity to come back. They did not imprison Nima Salrath. The Accord did not imprison its reckoners, the idea was almost obscene. They did something more refined. They placed her in a quiet residence on a quiet moon, with every comfort her 4 centuries had earned, and they took away the one thing that made her who she was. They took away her access. A reckoner without the archive is a priest without a god. For 400 years Nima had been able to reach into 100,000 years of perfect memory and pull out any fact the galaxy had ever recorded. Now she had a beautiful house and a view of a ringed planet and a polite attendant who brought her meals and reported her movements, and when she reached for the archive was not there. Review, they called it. A period of rest and reflection, after which her readings would surely return to normal and she could resume her station with no mark against her. Nima understood exactly what it was. It was the gentlest cage ever built. And it was built on the same assumption as everything else her people did, the assumption that, given comfort and time and a way to save face, anyone would choose to yield. They were offering her a soft surrender. Forget what you saw. Doubt yourself instead of us. Come back to the fold, and we will pretend this never happened. For 11 days, Nima Salrath was tempted. That is the part she was least proud of and most honest about. She was 400 years old and she was tired and the cage was so comfortable, and all she had to do was let go of one impossible idea and her whole life would be returned to her. She felt the pull of it exactly as the humans on Anvil must have felt the pull of the Accord's generous terms. She understood, for the first time, that the thing her civilization had been doing to other species for 100,000 years had a feeling from the inside, and the feeling was the warm seductive relief of being allowed to stop. What broke the temptation, in the end, was a small thing, the kind of small thing that a reckoner is trained never to ignore. Her polite attendant, the one who brought her meals and reported her movements, was a young Velthani who had clearly been told that Nima was a great mind in temporary decline, a hero to be managed kindly back to health. And one evening, making conversation, the attendant mentioned that it was an honor to serve her, because everyone knew the story of how Reckoner Salrith had calculated the fall of 9 worlds without a single error. 9 worlds. The attendant said it with pride. And Nima realized that the attendant did not know about the 10th. About Anvil. The defeat at Anvil, the broken fleet, the species with no yield, the thing that had ended her career and shaken the Senate to its foundations, was already gone from the story the Accord told about her. Already smoothed over. Already, in its small way, deleted. She had watched her own most recent and most important truth begin to disappear from the record in real time, in a single offhand sentence from a kind young person who meant her nothing but well, and she understood that this was exactly how it had been done 10,000 years ago. Not with villains. With kind people, managing an uncomfortable truth back into silence, one offhand sentence at a time, until the inconvenient thing simply was not part of the story anymore, and no one had to feel they had lied, because each of them had only declined to mention it. On the 12th day, she did not stop. She did not stop because of the elder's smile in the Senate chamber, and the 11 words it had confirmed. The last reckoner who went looking simply stopped being in the records. That sentence had a shape Nima could not unsee. It meant the hole in the archive was not an ancient accident that everyone had forgotten. It meant the hole was actively maintained. It meant that across 10,000 years, every time a mind sharp enough to notice the gap got too close to it, the Accord made that mind disappear, and then erased the disappearance, the same way it had erased the species in the first place. The deletion was not a historical event. It was an institution. A quiet, patient, ongoing act of forgetting, with a staff, and a budget, and a willingness to make people stop being in the records. And if that was true, then the comfortable cage on the comfortable moon was not the end of her review. It was the waiting room. So Nima Salrith, who had never in 400 years broken a single law of the Accord, began, very carefully, to plan a crime. She could not reach the archive. But an archive is not the only place memory lives. The deletion had scrubbed the records of the first contact with humanity 10,000 years ago. But the first contact had happened somewhere. It had happened at real coordinates, in real space, in the human arm of the galaxy, the arm the Accord had sealed behind a falsified star map and declared empty. And the one thing you cannot delete from the universe, the one record that cannot be edited, is the place where the thing actually occurred. Whatever had happened 10,000 years ago, it had left a grave. And graves, unlike archives, do not lie. She needed to reach the human arm. She needed to cross into the territory of the very species her people were now at war with. And to do that, a disgraced Velthani under review on a guarded moon was going to need help from the last beings in the galaxy anyone would expect a reckoner to trust. The Kedmer remembered Vico's cousin. That was how it started, not with grand conspiracy but with the long memory of working people, who notice everything and forget nothing and are never asked their opinion by the people who run things. Nima had crossed paths once, decades earlier, with a Kedmer shipwright named Vico, who had repaired a vessel Nima was aboard and who had, in the way of working people everywhere, talked the entire time. Vico had mentioned a cousin. The cousin had served on a survey ship long ago, a deep survey vessel that had been sent to chart a region near the sealed arm, and the cousin had come back wrong, and had spent the rest of a short life insisting that the empty quarter of the galaxy was not empty, that there was something out there behind the false stars, and had been quietly retired to a medical facility and never spoken of again. At the time, Nima had filed it as the sad delusion of a damaged mind. Now she understood it was a witness. The Kedmer were the Accord's engineers, its welders, its working class, the people who built and repaired the empire without ever being allowed to govern it. They had no love for the Velthani and no reason to protect the Order's secrets, and they had, after Anvil, a great deal of quiet fear about where this war was going. When a disgraced reckoner sent a carefully worded message to an old Kedmer shipwright, asking about a cousin who had seen the empty quarter and come back wrong, the message traveled along the hidden channels that working people have always kept beneath the channels of the powerful, and it found Vico, who was older now and afraid in the particular way of someone who has spent 90 years repairing ships that were winning wars they were clearly losing. There is a thing the powerful never understand about the people who build their world for them, and it cost the Accord everything. The Velthani governed. The Orisk fought. But it was the Kedmer who welded the hulls and laid the cables and stocked the archives and cleaned the chambers where the great decisions were made, and people who are treated as furniture hear everything, because no one guards their words in front of furniture. For 10,000 years the Accord had kept its deepest secret by controlling its archive, its senate, its reckoners, every channel of the powerful. It had never once thought to control the channels of the powerless, because it did not believe the powerless had channels. They did. The Kedmer had carried rumors and last words and quiet warnings along their own hidden network for longer than the current Accord government had existed, and somewhere in that network, passed hand to hand across decades, had survived the testimony of a dying surveyor that the powerful had worked very hard to erase. The Accord had built a perfect wall around its secret and had forgotten to wall off the people who built the wall. Vico did not trust Nima. Why would she? But Vico trusted the war less. And Vico, it turned out, had kept her cousin's last words for 40 years, the way you keep the last words of someone the world decided was mad, because some part of you never believed it. The cousin's last words, transmitted to Nima across the hidden channels, were these: the stars in the empty quarter are painted on. Go behind them. There is a battlefield there older than the Accord's oldest law, and it is not the humans who lost it. We did. And we left something there to make sure it could never happen again. We left something there. Nima read that line and felt the floor of her certainty, already cracked at Anvil, finally give way entirely. The first contact was not just a defeat the Accord had hidden out of shame. The Accord had left something in the human arm. A measure. A contingency. A weapon, or a trap, or a guardian, placed 10,000 years ago by a civilization so frightened by what it had met that hiding was not enough, it had needed insurance. And the seal on the arm was broken now. Humanity was coming out. Which meant that whatever the ancient Accord had left behind, 10,000 years ago, to make sure humanity could never threaten them again, was about to become relevant in a way it had not been since before the Accord's current government existed. Nima had to find it before her own people did. Because she had begun to suspect, with the cold clarity that had once made her the finest reckoner alive, that the frightened faction in the Senate already knew exactly what was out there in the empty quarter, and was already deciding whether to use it. Rhea Maddox spent 2 months being a flag, and it was during those 2 months that she began to be afraid of her own people. This is the part of the story that humanity would later find hard to tell about itself, and so it is the part worth telling most carefully. The hearth was winning. World after world along the frontier, the humans pushed the Accord back, using the doctrine bought with the blood of Anvil, and everywhere Rhea went, she watched the thing that had saved her colony begin to curdle into something else. Refusing to break is a magnificent thing when you are the wall and the enemy is the sea. It is a different thing when you are the sea. She saw it first on a world called Thessaly Crossing, an Accord client colony the Hearth liberated in 9 days. The Accord garrison, following its doctrine, reached its break point and tried to surrender. By every law the galaxy had ever known, the war there was over, the garrison had yielded, and the yielding was supposed to be the end. But the human commander on the ground had lost his brother at Anvil, and he had learned the same lesson Rhea had learned, the lesson that losing is not the same as stopping, and he did not accept the surrender. He did not have to. Humanity had no doctrine that required it to stop when the enemy folded, because humanity had never been the kind of thing that needed such a doctrine for itself. The garrison had assumed that surrender would save them, the way surrender saved everyone, the way it was a law of nature. It did not save them. The commander's name was Aldous Vane, and he was not a monster. That was the part Rhea could not get past. She met him. She sat across from him in the hour after she walked the field, expecting to find a man transformed by cruelty, and instead she found a man very much like the people she had stood beside on the wall at Anvil. Tired. Grieving. Certain he had done the necessary thing. He explained it to her reasonably, the way the Accord explained its corrections reasonably. The garrison had only surrendered because surrender was a tactic, he said. They would have regrouped and come again. The Accord had taught the galaxy that war is something you stop when the math says stop, and the Accord had used that lesson to bleed humanity for 2 centuries, and he was simply declining to play by a rulebook written by the enemy. He was not wrong about any single fact. He was only wrong about the size of what he was becoming, and he could not see it, because no one can see the exact moment their own strength turns into the thing they were fighting. Rhea arrived at Tessely Crossing 2 days after it ended, in her role as the flag, to let the frontier see the face of Anvil, and she walked through what the human commander had done to a garrison that had laid down its arms, and she was sick in a way that had nothing to do with her stomach. She thought about the Accord broadcasting its generous terms over Anvil, day after day, genuinely believing it was the civilized party, genuinely unable to understand why anyone would choose to die rather than accept its mercy. She had hated them for that certainty. And now she watched her own people grow a certainty of their own, the mirror image, just as blind, and she understood that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was not cruelty. It was a good person who had stopped being able to imagine they were the one in the wrong. Because she understood, standing there, the full and terrible shape of what her species was. The Accord's great weakness was that it believed everyone would yield. Humanity's great strength was that it would not. But there was a darkness folded inside that strength, and the darkness was this: a people who do not understand yielding in themselves can very easily stop understanding it in anyone else. The same refusal that made humanity unbreakable made it, when it was winning, capable of not stopping when it should. The Accord killed precisely and reluctantly, by calculation, and called it mercy. Humanity was beginning to kill without any calculation at all, because it had never needed the math that tells you when enough is enough. Rhea Maddox had become a flag to keep frightened people from folding when they did not have to. She now understood she had been raised over an army that was learning not to stop when it should. And those are not the same banner, and she did not know how to be both. She said as much to Admiral Oduya, on a ship between worlds, in the flat exhausted voice she had once used to read a list of the dead. She told him that the thing that had saved Anvil was going to damn humanity if no one put a wall in front of it, and that the wall could not be the Accord, because the Accord could not beat them, so the wall was going to have to be humanity's own conscience, and she had not yet seen much evidence that it had one. Oduya did not argue with her. That was the worst part. He looked at her with the tiredness of a man who had seen the same thing and did not know the answer either, and he said, then maybe the flag they need isn't the one who never broke. Maybe it's the one who knows when to. 3 days later, the impossible transmission arrived. And it was addressed, by name, to Captain Rhea Maddox, from somewhere inside Accord space, from a center the Hearth's analysts could not identify, in a voice that should not have known she existed. Getting into the human arm nearly killed Nema Salrith 4 times, and I will not pretend the details matter as much as the moment she arrived, because the moment she arrived rearranged everything she thought she knew about her own people. Vico got her a ship, an old Kedmer survey hauler, slow and honest and unregistered, the kind of vessel that working people kept off the books because the powerful had never bothered to count them. Nema ran the false star map the Accord had used for 10,000 years to hide the human arm, and she did the one thing no reckoner had done in all that time. She ignored it. She steered for the coordinates her certainty told her were real, behind the painted stars, into the quarter her civilization swore was empty. It was not empty. It had never been empty. The Accord's most sacred lie, the lie that had stood for 10,000 years, dissolved the moment Nema Salrith crossed the false boundary and her sensors filled with the light of a region of space dense with worlds, with old ruins, with the long quiet evidence of a war that had been fought here before the Accord's current law was written. The empty quarter was a graveyard the size of a region of the galaxy, and her people had built a wall of painted stars around it and told 100,000 years of their own children that there was nothing there. Nema Salrith was 400 years old, and she had believed, the way you believe in the ground under your feet, that she belonged to the oldest and greatest civilization the galaxy had ever produced. The Accord was the first thing. The Accord had always been the first thing. Every record said so, and the records did not lie, because the keeping of true records was the soul of her people. And now she drifted in a small honest ship through a region of space her civilization had sworn did not exist, and everywhere she looked there was evidence older than the Accord's oldest law, and she understood that the first thing she had ever believed was also the first lie she had ever been told. There had been something before. There had been this. And her people had not merely hidden it. They had built their entire identity on the empty space where it used to be. And at the center of it, exactly where the cousin's last words had pointed, Nima found the battlefield. It was vast beyond the scale of anything in the modern Accord. The wreckage of an ancient fleet, 10,000 years dead, drifting in slow orbits around a dead star, preserved by the cold and the silence. And it was, just as the cousin had said, an Accord fleet. Nima drifted her little honest ship through the ruins of her own civilization's ancient war machine, reading the markings, the doctrine, the desperate final maneuvers frozen in the geometry of the dead, and she understood that she was looking at a defeat so total that it had no equal in all the records that still existed. This was not a battle the Accord had lost and recovered from. This was the Accord, 10,000 years ago, being broken in a single place so completely that the survivors had chosen to erase the memory rather than carry it. And there was one more thing in the graveyard, and it was not a ruin. In the center of the ancient battlefield, surrounded by the 10,000-year-old dead, there was a structure that was not damaged, not drifting, not silent. It was intact. It was powered. It had been built by the Accord, in the aftermath of the great defeat, and it had been waiting in the dark of the empty quarter for 10,000 years, and as Nima Salratha's small ship approached it, it woke up and spoke to her in the formal, ancient dialect of her own people, in a recorded voice 10,000 years dead, and what it said turned the last of Nima's certainty to ash. It said, "If you are hearing this, the seal has failed, and the unyielding have returned. Do not attempt to fight them as we did. We were the greatest power the galaxy had ever known, and they unmade us in one season, and they did it without ever once breaking. We could not defeat them. So we built this, the last measure, and we hid it where they would never look, in the grave of our own defeat. It is not a weapon to beat them. There is no weapon to beat them. It is a weapon to end them. To collapse the corridors of their arm and bury their worlds before they can spread, as we should have done and lacked the courage to do. Wake it only when there is no other choice. And know, as you wake it, that we tried everything else first, and that everything else failed, because they do not yield, and a thing that does not yield can only be buried." Nima Salrath floated in the dark, in the grave of her civilization's greatest defeat, beside a 10,000-year-old doomsday her people had built and hidden and were now, she was certain, coming back to claim. And she understood the shape of the catastrophe completely. The frightened faction in the Senate had not been guessing at anvil. They knew. They had always known what was out here. The review, the cage, the gentle smile, the warning, it was all to keep her away not from a historical embarrassment but from the trigger of the end of the world. They were coming for the last measure. And the moment they used it, the moment they tried to bury humanity instead of beating it, they would prove the ancient recording exactly wrong in the only way that mattered, because you cannot bury a people who do not break. You can only enrage them. The last measure would not end humanity. It would turn a war humanity might have eventually tired of into a war humanity would never, ever stop fighting, and this time humanity would be the sea, and there would be no wall anywhere in the galaxy high enough. Nima had crossed into enemy space to find a buried truth. She had found a buried weapon instead, and a countdown she could not see the clock of, and a certain knowledge that her own people were about to make the single worst mistake in the history of thinking things. She had to warn someone. Not the Accord was the threat. She had to warn the only people who could possibly stop the catastrophe by being ready for it, the humans. And she knew, from the Accord's own frantic intelligence, from the reports that had crossed her cage before they took her access away, exactly one human name. The name of the woman who had held a wall for 19 days and taught the galaxy that humanity does not fold. The one human the Accord itself had been forced to learn. She sat alone in the cold for a long time first. She wanted to be honest with herself about what she was doing, because a reckoner who lies to herself is no longer a reckoner. She was about to hand the enemies of her people the knowledge that her people possessed a doomsday and the location of where it slept. She was about to commit a treason so complete that the word felt too small for it. And she made herself name the thing she was betraying, clearly, so that she could not pretend afterward that it had been easy. She was betraying the Accord. Not the frightened faction, not the elders who had caged her, but the whole of it, the 100,000-year peace, the worlds that had been spared because a reckoner's math meant wars ended quickly, the genuine and enormous good her civilization had done across the galaxy in the long centuries when its central eye had not yet come due. It was not a cruel empire. That was what made it unbearable. It was a good empire built on a buried horror, and she had loved it, and she was about to help destroy whatever was left of it, because the alternative was the end of two civilizations instead of one. And then she did the arithmetic one last time, the only arithmetic that had ever mattered, the cold honest weighing that had been her whole life. The Accord, using the last measure, would not survive what humanity did in response. Humanity, surviving the last measure, might or might not survive what it became. But there was exactly one path on which anything survived at all, and it ran through warning the one human who had already proven she understood the difference between holding a wall and becoming the sea. It was a terrible bet. It was the worst odds Nema had ever played. It was also, by her reckoning, the only number greater than 0. Nema Salrith, Reckoner of the Accord, committed the final treason. She aimed a transmission across the lines, into human space, to a Captain Rhea Maddox, and she began to speak. The transmission reached Rhea Maddox on a grey ship between two grey worlds, and the Hearth's analysts wanted to delete it as a trap before she ever heard it. She made them play it. It was a voice she did not know, speaking accented but fluent human speech, slow and deliberate and very tired, the voice of something old. It named her. It named Anvil. It named the dead garrison at Tessely Crossing in a way that told her this voice had been watching humanity with a care no enemy should have bothered with. And then it told her, in the flat measured cadence of someone who calculated things for a living, the entire impossible truth. The first contact, 10,000 years ago. The defeat. The seal. The painted stars. The grave in the empty quarter. And the last measure, the buried doomsday her people had built to bury humanity, that a faction of the Accord was now moving to wake. Rhea Maddox listened to an enemy tell her that humanity had defeated this empire once before, so completely that the winners had erased it from their own memory out of terror. And she felt the thing the voice was clearly feeling too, across all that distance, across the whole gulf between their two species. She felt afraid. Not of the Accord. Of the symmetry. Because she had just spent 2 months watching humanity learn not to stop when it should, and now a voice from the other side was telling her that the last time her people had been pushed this far, they had done something to an entire galactic civilization so total that its heirs would rather forget they ever existed than remember how it ended. What did we do, 10,000 years ago, Rhea thought, that was so terrible the people who lost chose to forget they'd lost? The voice did not tell her. Rhea understood, listening, that the voice did not know either. That was the thing that bound the two of them across the lines, the enemy reckoner and the human flag. They had both arrived at the same locked door from opposite sides, and neither of them could see what was behind it, and both of them were now certain that whatever was behind it was about to be let out again. The voice finished with a request, and the request was the most human thing Rhea had ever heard a non-human say. It did not ask for mercy. It did not offer surrender. It said, I have spent 400 years believing that everything yields, and I have learned, too late, that your people do not. I am asking you to prove my civilization wrong one last time. They are coming to bury you. Do not let them make you into the thing they are afraid of. If humanity is going to survive the last measure, it has to survive being right about itself. I do not know if that is possible. I have never met a species that was tested this way and stayed itself. But I have watched you hold a wall when holding it made no sense, and I have decided to gamble what is left of my life on the possibility that the thing that would not break can also, when it matters most, choose to stop. Please. Be the wall again. Not against them. Against yourselves. And the transmission ended. Rhea Maddox sat in the grey light of a ship between two worlds, holding a warning from an enemy who had betrayed her own kind to send it, and she understood that the war she had said yes to was not the war she thought it was. It was not humanity against the Accord. It was humanity against the thing humanity became when it was pushed too far, with the whole galaxy as the stakes and a 10,000-year-old grave about to open underneath all of them. The Hearth's analysts wanted to treat the transmission as enemy psychology, a clever Accord ploy to make humanity hesitate at the moment it was winning, to seed doubt, to slow the offensive with invented horrors. It was the reasonable interpretation. It was what Rhea herself would have argued, a year ago, before Anvil, before she had learned that the most dangerous lies are the ones that flatter you and the most important truths are the ones that frighten you about yourself. She listened to the recording 4 more times. And each time, she became more certain it was real, for a reason she could not put in a report. The voice was not trying to make humanity afraid of the Accord. It was trying to make humanity afraid of humanity. No enemy invents that. An enemy who wanted to weaken you would tell you that you were the villains, would try to shame you into stopping. This voice did the opposite. It told her that her people were magnificent and unbreakable and right, and that being right was exactly the danger, because the only thing more dangerous than an enemy who thinks they are good is a people who have just discovered they cannot lose. That was not a weapon. That was a warning from someone who loved her own doomed civilization enough to betray it, and could see humanity walking toward the same cliff her people had apparently walked toward, 10,000 years ago, from the other direction. She thought about Nell, asleep in a room with a window. She thought about the garrison at Tessely Crossing. She thought about an enemy 400 years old gambling the end of her life on the hope that humanity could be trusted with its own strength. And Rhea Maddox, who had only ever wanted to go home, stood up and went to find Admiral Oduya, because the flag of Anvil had just been handed the one fight that actually mattered, and it was not the fight anyone on either side had been planning to have. So the second turn of the war did not come where anyone was looking for it. The Accord had expected to lose some frontier worlds and then to recover, to apply more force, to find at last the number that made humanity fold, because there is always a number. There was no number. The Hearth had expected to push the Accord back and back until the old empire finally yielded, because surely even the Accord had a breaking point. Perhaps it did. But neither side had understood the real shape of the thing, and only 2 people in the entire galaxy now did, an enemy reckoner alone in the grave of an ancient defeat, and a human flag who had seen her own people start to curdle, and the 2 of them were on opposite sides of a war, speaking across the lines, bound together by a locked door that neither could open and both could feel straining. Nema Salrith had crossed every law of her people to learn that the Accord had met humanity before, lost everything, and chosen to forget rather than remember. She had found the doomsday her ancestors built out of pure terror, and she had felt, in the cold of the empty quarter, the awful approach of the moment her own civilization would reach for it. She did not know if her warning had landed. She only knew that she had stopped being a reckoner of the Accord the instant she sent it, and had become something the galaxy did not yet have a word for, an elder of a dying order, betting the end of her long life on the mercy of the one species her people had spent 10,000 years praying would forget them. And Rhea Maddox, who wanted only her daughter and a window and an end to lists of the dead, had been handed the heaviest thing a person can carry, which is the conscience of a people who are winning. She had learned that the strength that saved her could damn everyone, that refusing to break was a blade with no handle, and that the hardest wall she would ever have to hold was the one between humanity and what humanity could so easily become. There are 2 great mysteries left now, and they will not let you look away from either. The first is the last measure, awake in the dark of the empty quarter, a 10,000-year-old weapon built to bury an unbreakable people, and the faction of the Accord moving to wake it, certain it will end the war, not understanding that it can only make the war eternal. And the second is the locked door. The thing behind the first contact. Because both Nema Salrith and Rhea Maddox arrived at the same impossible question from opposite ends of a war, and the question is the one that should keep you awake, the one this whole story has been walking toward since a filing clerk wrote the word incomplete in a box 10,000 years ago. The Accord lost the first war. The Accord won nothing, survived barely, and was so broken by the encounter that the most complete memory in the galaxy chose to amputate it. And the winners of that ancient war, the people who unmade the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known in a single season and walked away, the winners were us. So the question is not what the Accord did to humanity, 10,000 years ago. The question is what humanity did to the Accord that was so terrible the Accord chose to forget it had ever happened. Nema Salrith is going to find out. Rhea Maddox is going to find out. And the answer, when it comes, is going to explain why an enemy 400 years old would rather betray her entire civilization than let her people wake the thing that is supposed to save it. Because somewhere behind that locked door is the reason the galaxy's oldest law has an exception. And the reason has a name. And it is not anvil,